done things differently and worked more cooperatively with the federal governments. There were times when the federal government could have been a better partner to the provinces as well.
Yeah.
I believe that there are lessons to be learned for all of us from that report. We will certainly reflect on what we could have and can do better. But I will point out that together we managed to put an end to a situation jeopardizing the security of Canadians in such a way as to protect Canadians' fundamental rights and freedoms. We managed to deal with the situation quickly with temporary, limited and reasonable measures. The in-depth inquiry, transparency and accountability that the Rouleau Commission and Commissioner Rouleau brought to the process can serve to reassure Canadians that even when times become difficult, our institutions, our democracy worked and was able to deal with an exceptional situation, an emergency. Next question.
Do you have any regrets about calling Ottawa protesters a fringe minority?
Yeah.
Good question.
I wish I had said that differently.
Yes.
Ooh.
As I look back on that and as I've reflected on it over the past months, not just freshly from this commissioner's report, I wish I had phrased it differently. The fact is, there is a very small number of people in this country who deliberately spread misinformation and disinformation that led to Canadians' deaths, that led to excessive hardship in people who believed them. I continue to be very, very firm against those individuals. But that is a small subset of people who were just hurting and worried and wanting to be heard. And as much as I tried to emphasize throughout the time that, of course, we're always going to stand up for freedom of speech and freedom to protest peacefully.
Of course.
I wish I hadn't said something that was able to be spread larger. If I had chosen my words a bit careful, been more specific, I think things might have been a bit easier.
That's believable if he didn't say it like 20 times in different ways.
Yes, I do regret
That's not the only thing he said.
Yeah, he said the same thing like 20 times in 20 different ways in 20 different interviews. All he did was call anybody who stood up to him names for several months. And so now he says that one thing that he said is regrettable. I would even cut the guy some slack because he is an idiot and completely inarticulate. If it weren't an ongoing pattern of behavior, this is not a one-of. This is exactly how Justin Trudeau thinks about the working class that don't come under his thumb in this country.
Not only that, he just dismissed the large size by saying that they were duped by this small fringe that he was referring to. Everybody else was just duped and they have no brains.
They're just stupid. They're just stupid. Yeah. They're easily misled.
Yeah. Anxieties and frustrations of many Canadians, legitimate certainly for them, in order to manipulate them and jeopardize their health, their safety, and their well-being. And I do not withdraw what I said about that small group, but I do regret that my comments on that small group might have been depicted as an attack on protesters, generally people who wanted to exercise their freedom of speech. That is not what I intended. I could have and should have chosen my words more carefully.
The government will deal with the recommendations within the year, but one of the recommendations is to have actually a plan in place within the next 6 months of how you're going to deal with the recommendations. Can you at least commit to having a plan in place within the next 6 months?
Yes.
Pour Le Devoir, vous êtes le premier gouvernement à avoir invoqué les
Le Devoir, you're the first government to have invoked the Emergencies Act. Do you think it will now be easier or more difficult for a future government to do the same? More difficult or less difficult? I don't know, but I do hope it remains very difficult. This is not something that should be done lightly. And I think that's what we have learned from the process, the very excellent recommendations by Commissioner Rouleau, including recommendations to codify what we did in any case because we were trying to do the right thing, will no doubt help a future government face the challenges we did. We were the first to face a challenge, but I do hope that this won't happen again. And I do hope that if it does, the government at the time will not need the Emergencies Act. It really is a last resort. And be it through recommendations for police forces, through recommendations on how the different levels of government can work together in crises, all that taken together, I hope, will mean that a future government won't need the Act. A quick follow-up on C-13. Will you require a line whip for C-13, given that this was a platform promise for the Liberals? All ministers will support C-13 because it is the solution that will make it possible to protect linguistic minorities across Canada. We recognize that we also have responsibility to protect French outside and within Quebec. I also know that some members, like all members, sometimes do, well, like all members do, will want to represent their communities. These are conversations we're in the process of having, but I assure you that C-13 will pass. Valérie Plante, Radio-Canada. In his report, Commissioner Rouleau wrote that during pandemics, we see social agitation, lack of social cohesion, and the result is that people don't behave as well as they should. Authorities should have anticipated that, he said. Do you think you underestimated the anger of Canadians, particularly since it's mandatory vaccinations for truckers that sparked it all? During the pandemic, well, at any time really, but especially during the pandemic, governments needed and need to take decisions that protect the health and safety of Canadians. The decisions during the pandemic were not easy, but we based them on science, expert advice, studies, physicians' recommendations, so that we did everything we could to keep Canadians safe. And it worked. We need to recognize that it worked. We had a less difficult and less deadly pandemic, less economically damaging pandemic than most of our peer countries. But that doesn't mean it was easy. It was nonetheless very difficult for all Canadians, those who were vaccinated and those who weren't. We saw full well that some Canadians profoundly disagreed with the measures we put in place. And we tried to deal with that. We tried to find ways of bringing people together. Clearly, we could have and should have done more, so I do take this very seriously. A responsible government must always try, yes, to protect people, but also to bring them together. There are lessons here for the future. but we hope not to have too many pandemics in the future. As for reforming the Emergencies Act, do you have a deadline for that or a calendar? We will carefully look at the recommendations and conclusions of the Rouleau Commission, and we will move responsibly in the year to come. Mr. Trudeau, Mylène Crête, La Presse. Speaking of reforming the Emergencies Act, Justice Rouleau recommended changing the definition of a threat to national security. What do you think of including a national threat to economic security or a threat to the nation's economic security? That is something we discussed within Cabinet significantly. Now, should we include economic issues in the definitions? I do think the Commissioner had a quite reasonable response in his approach. He said that we could and should consider economic issues as contributing to national security issues, but economic concerns would not in and of themselves be sufficient to constitute an emergency. So that is one of the things we took into account. We will now engage in a process of reflection to see whether we need to change those aspects of the definition. With regard to the definition used by CSIS, we saw that there was some confusion and lack of clarity in discussions and in analyses surrounding invocation of the Emergencies Act. I therefore think it's quite reasonable to seek to clarify a definition that does that, so that we don't end up with one definition interpreted two different ways. Do you have a message for people who took part in the Freedom Convoy? That they have and always will have the right to express their views, to express their disagreement with government policy, the approach that any government might take. They were heard. They were heard from the very start. However, as a government, we made a choice, and we chose to use science, data, and the views of experts, and use them as a basis for our decisions. Not everyone may agree, but we do base our decisions on science and data. And I believe that studies by international organizations have shown that over 80% of people were vaccinated. We had measures to help small businesses, families, workers, seniors, young people get through that very difficult period. We see in their analyses that countries who did that had a better outcome than countries that did not put science at the heart of their decision-making. We are a magnificent and diverse country, and our diversity isn't just a diversity of where we come from, it's a diversity of points of views, so we need to listen to one another, and we will continue to do that.
I think the first thing I'd say to people who joined these protests, these occupations, is first of all, they will always have a right to be heard, to express themselves, to protest peacefully things they disagree with. And they have been heard. They've expressed very clearly their views, their perspectives, and they're hurt. At the same time, however, We are a government that is grounded in science and data and expert advice, and we followed the advice of public health officers and medical professionals to keep Canadians safe during a pandemic. That include encouraging through every means we could people to get vaccinated. And that worked. We had a better pandemic than many of our peer countries, with fewer deaths, with lower levels of economic disruption, with greater social cohesion than many other places. And we will continue to listen to all voices across this wonderfully diverse country that isn't just diverse geographically or culturally or in origins, but also in perspectives. But listening to each other goes in both directions. We hear their skepticism around science. But they need to also hear our belief in science. These are conversations that we need to have. Not to say, of course, that everyone who chose not to get vaccinated doesn't believe in science. Of course not. Individuals can make decisions for themselves.
What do you mean, of course not?
And we'll always respect that.
Oh my God!
But
I can't.
Those
even
individuals
with this guy.
who deliberately chose to amplify falsehoods and put their fellow citizens at risk, those were things that a government needs to stand firmly against, because our job is to keep Canadians safe. That's what we did during this Emergencies Act. That's what we did during this pandemic. That's what we will continue to do.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, tout le monde.
Press conference. Merci, ça va mettre fin à la conférence presse.
I'm so glad I didn't have too much to eat. So much.
I can't.
So much.
I can't believe his gaslighting BS. First of all, he says that, I wish I had phrased it differently that one time that I said it, not the 20 other times that you said it. And then he says, we respect everybody's right to choose. Except you didn't give them a choice. It's not a choice if it's coercion. It is not a choice if they are being vaccinated against unemployment instead of a disease. Because that's what ultimately it came down to. Exactly. That's not a choice.
Yes. And this is after months and months of that. It's not like as soon as these mandates came into place, the convoy happened. There was all of these other efforts to try to get him to reason. And then he was saying over and over that people who felt this way, in addition to the people who were coerced and still had their jobs, were not just extremists, misogynists as well. A small fringe minority. And he didn't say some of them. He said many or most of them were these things.
Yes. Yeah.
And what about that?
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, they said they were protecting us from people who had like ideology that was extreme or whatnot. When he said, again, anybody who was unvaccinated was an extremist, pretty much, is what our prime minister said.
Yes.
I think that his own MPs are maybe like, I'm just guessing that maybe they're like, you have to tone it down with this. Like, you have to say something there. And maybe that's why we saw this sad excuse of saying that he would have said it differently.
There were points at which he said where he was raging against people, like where he was visibly angry with people. So this is not just like I said it clumsily. Ooh, forgive me. I'm just a dumb drama teacher. Again, I say I would probably cut him that slack, but he said it like 20 times. He also said we didn't want to invoke the Emergencies Act.
I know. That was laughable.
It reminded me of like a wife beater where he's like, I didn't want to punch you in the face, but you didn't listen to me the first time. That was immediately my response there, because they did want to. We saw the documents in the Public Order Emergency Commission. It was like the first thing they thought about was like, do we get to use it on them now? Like they weren't even in Ottawa yet. And they're like, let's emergency act them.
And he didn't talk to them. He hid in his ivory tower. He never talked to the people. Like we had no choice. We had to keep people safe. And this is how we felt. He said the word felt. We had to do it. How about talking to the Canadians that showed up once you realize, oh, shoot, this isn't a small fringe minority? Maybe you could address some of their concerns before you invoked the Emergencies Act. But you're right. They were so eager to press that button. It wasn't even funny. And it isn't funny. And here we are later just hearing that it's justified. But there were some good questions. I'm thankful that there was a Q&A. And there was a couple of good questions out of that. Like, is this a failure of I can't say the word.
Federalism.
Federalism.
As an Albertan, I would suggest yes, because it showed us how little we actually need the federal government, because the blockades were over in Alberta when they called the Emergencies Act, and they wouldn't help us, even if in whatever way that our provincial government asked for it. We needed tow trucks. They wouldn't give us tow trucks that were sitting on the base in Edmonton, the CAF base. They wouldn't give us those tow trucks. So the provincial government just went out and bought their own. They just they realized the help was never coming. And so Justin Trudeau, when somebody asked him, is it a failure of federalism? Maybe, but as an Albertan, I think it's probably a reason we don't need federalism.
Yeah, good point. There's just so much in there. And then Freeland comes up there and says, we have to remember we did this so that nobody could get hurt. It's like, no, that's how people got hurt. You literally hurt people by invoking that. You trampled people. Our very own Alexa Laveau got shot with that. So like, they're just, for people who haven't watched the other side of the story, they're probably just eating these phrases up. Like, oh yeah, it was extremists. They were going to hurt us and nobody got hurt. And so this was the better cause. But the reality is people were there for 3 weeks without getting hurt.
Yeah. Only when the Emergencies Act got invoked did people start to get hurt, and that violence was coming from the government side. The part that really I find chilling, and I mentioned this in my monologue today because I'm filling in for Ezra on the Ezra Levant show, is the fourth recommendation of the commissioner, and that is to reform the law. We've only ever used this law one time in 30 years. And we didn't even use it when a terror cell was running amok in Toronto in the early 2000s, plotting bombing attacks. We didn't use it then. But the one time they did use it, he wants to reform the law. To what? Yeah. To obviously make it even more vague and easy to use, because the law is actually very specific. They're pretending like it's vague for some reason, but the law is very specific, and it has to rise to Section 2 of the CSIS Act. It didn't. But they're all pretending like, well, it could be this, could be that. No, there's none of that in the law. So when they say reform the law, they mean to make it more gray areas, a little bit more fringe around the edges, so that you can basically whip this thing out whenever you want, whenever you're embarrassing Justin Trudeau on the international scale. I think that's what's going to happen here. And some of the suggestions from Rouleau, like a media, like a social media monitoring agency. Oh dear. To make sure we're using social media appropriately. That Justin Trudeau is going to jump right on that. And he said, we're going to examine the recommendations and we're going to adopt as many of them as we can. So by the way, before I'm going to sign off here at 2 Mountain, which is 2 minutes from now, and Alexa Lavoie is going to jump in. She was in the media lockup, and I think we might even have a lawyer willing to come on and talk to, whoever's left after I'm gone. But when did you know the fix was in? Because I'll tell you when I knew the fix was in. I thought Rouleau might be fair in the beginning, but it was when I was in Ottawa. That way. Yeah. I knew the fix was in when I was in Ottawa, and I watched the lawyers that I was sitting behind groan as they were getting documents relating to the witness they were currently examining. They were only getting the disclosure as the witness was testifying after they've had like 9 months and a delay and entire government ministries dedicated to information disclosure. They were only getting these documents as they were examining the witness. And when the lawyers complained, they couldn't even get Justice Rouleau to say, that's unfair. Can't do that. He wouldn't even issue a ruling. He threw out a lawyer who wanted a ruling.
It's not just one or two documents too. It's a ton of stuff that they have to go through. I think something that stood out to me a lot was when they said that, didn't they say that there were some areas that would be discussed away from the lawyers? Like they wouldn't even have information. They said it was for our own national security that they couldn't hear, but it's like, well, what was discussed behind closed doors by Trudeau and everything like that. So that was a big one for me.
Yeah. Same for me. Just it felt at times when I was watching the commission that Rouleau was losing control of what was happening and that the lawyers didn't respect him because how could they? How could they? I mean, it was so obvious that the government was playing games with the evidentiary process and they were completely getting away with it. And that was his job as the commissioner, was to make sure that that stuff didn't happen. So that's when I knew, no, this isn't fair. It's not going to be fair. And none of this matters because we are going to come to a certain conclusion.
So do we know how much money has gone into this public inquiry? Because I know with the mass shooting in Nova Scotia, it's millions of dollars. Like how much money went into getting him told that he was justified?
I don't know.
We should look into that.
We should look into that.
Rebel investigates.
Rebel investigates multi-million dollars. I mean, I don't think we'll ever even know the full extent of the amount of people whose hands touched all of this. And just the sheer volume, like in Rouleau's decision today, he bragged about the sheer volume of documents that were released. Yeah, unfortunately, that's a hell of a lot of documents to be releasing to the lawyers as they are examining the witnesses and expecting them to be able to examine the witnesses based on the information in the documents they just got. And
what's scary about this is it almost sets precedent of sorts to do it again the next time somebody disagrees with, the Trudeau government. And I think they used the wording of the act. It was appropriate and effective, which really reminds me of how they discussed COVID-19 vaccines. I won't say more than that because we're on YouTube, but it's that same wording. So you wonder if they make the revisions to it and then they have this ruling out of the commission, how quick will they do it next time? Maybe it's 1 weekend.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this is just, I really worry about those recommendations. And that was one of the things I talked to Keith Wilson, convoy lawyer, about, was when the recommendations come. Because he thought, of course, they're going to find Justin Trudeau completely justified.
Yeah, exactly.
And he said, and then it's the recommendations that we have to worry about. Because we know whether he was found to be justified or found to be unjustified, none of it matters. Justin Trudeau that faces no consequences for anything he's ever done. So it didn't matter. It's the recommendations that we should be very, very frightened of. There's
got to be a lot of people watching with stuff to say. If you guys are just tuning in now, you can actually chat to us so that we can read your comment. You can do so on Rumble and Odyssey. And actually, if you do a donation of $5 or more, we try to read that. I'd love to hear from what you guys are thinking about this as well.
Yes. Olivia, maybe we could run the the commission documentary ad, Trudeau on Trial, and then we'll bring Alexa in, if you wouldn't mind, because we have a documentary that our friend Kian Simone made, that I alluded to off the top of the show, that documents all the things that Justice Paul Rouleau doesn't want you to know. Because if you see this documentary, you will realize that there's no possible way he could have come to the decision he announced today. And it's at trudeauontrial.com.
Yeah.
I will sign off. Let's watch that ad. And then our friend Alexa Lavoie will join us.
I am speaking to you at a moment of grave crisis. when violent and fanatical men are attempting to destroy the unity and the freedom of Canada.
But after weeks of dangerous and unlawful activities, after weeks of people being harassed in their neighborhoods and small businesses forced to close,
As democracy flourishes in Canada,
we don't always agree, and that's okay.
because individual liberty is cherished in Canada.
Our government will always defend freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly.
It has now been demonstrated to us by a few misguided persons
After evidence of increased ideologically motivated violent extremism activity across the country,
just how fragile a democratic society can be.
it became clear that local and provincial authorities needed more tools to restore order and keep people safe.
These are matters of the utmost gravity, and I want to tell you what the government is doing to deal with them.
The federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act.
The public's legitimate right to know why the government proclaimed an emergency and whether the actions it took were appropriate.
It is our view that there was no justification whatsoever to invoke the Emergencies Act.
It's so tough to watch. There's no reason for that. They were literally running the horses through the crowd.
The police came straight to me and he targeted me and he took his gun of tear gas and he actually shot me directly in my legs.
Was it worth invoking the Emergencies Act, ma'am, to trample on the rights and freedoms of Canadians?
Why do you think excessive honking means that the government should strip citizens away from their rights?
Our next and final witness is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Order à l'ordre.
Have you checked out the fresh new swag we have at rebelnewsstore.com? Like this nifty resistance trucker sweater? We have warm, cozy sweaters, t-shirts, mugs, hats, phone cases, you name it. Everything to fit your freedom-loving needs or maybe even trigger a liberal family member or friend. And for a limited time, you can use code TAMARA10 at checkout to save 10% off of your total order. So head on over to rebelnewsstore.com, check out all of our new designs, make some purchases, and use code TAMARA, that's TAMARA 10 at checkout for 10% off your order. Head on over, check it out.
Oh, hey guys, thanks for watching the live stream and sorry for interrupting, but I just wanted to pop on to tell you about this incredible sweatshirt that I'm wearing, but also all the other great merchandise that we have available at rebelnewsstore.com. We're adding new stuff all the time, so be sure to keep checking. Even if you shop today, there might be something new tomorrow. And if you are shopping, be sure to use the coupon code Sheila10 for 10% off at checkout. Again, it's rebelnewsstore.com, coupon code Sheila10 for 10% off at checkout.
If you want to look good and shine like me, you can do so at our store. Go to rebelnewsstore.com. On this website, you have so much different style to wear, as this one, my favorite one, Justin Castro. With my code Alexa10, you will have 10% off on your next purchase. So don't hesitate, go now and look so good like me.
I guess I always love that ad, Alexa. Hello, Alexa Laveau and the great Alan Honor. Thanks for joining the live stream.
It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, Drea. Hi, Alexa.
Now, did you guys get a chance to look at what we just witnessed Prime Minister Trudeau say after being justified by the Commission? Oh. We're having some difficulties here, I guess.
Maybe I
you
can
heard
jump
me?
in.
Oh, okay. I can hear you now, Alexa. You go first. How do you feel about them saying that it was used to keep people safe so that nobody would get hurt? That's what Chrystia Freeland said. Oh, I don't know. Sorry, guys. Looks like we're having issues.
Yeah.
Okay, Alan, I'm going to move to you. You were one of the great lawyers. You even got to pose questions to some of the people who were testifying. So, what do you make of the findings, first of all, here?
Well, Drea, the findings aren't especially surprising. One thing I noticed as soon as Justice Trudeau came out and he gave his initial remarks to Parliament and to everyone else is that there were two things that I agreed with. And number one, he thought that the evidence that he relied upon to reach the conclusion he did wasn't particularly overwhelming. And the other thing he said, and I thought this was very important, is that reasonable people who are well informed can come to a different conclusion than he came to.
Which, yeah, that's something interesting to point out. Now, you are a lawyer with the Democracy Fund. We've partnered with you guys many times because you've done great work fighting for civil liberties, especially when it came to how people's rights were infringed upon with COVID-19 mandates. So I'm sure you have heard at the Democracy Fund many times people hurt or upset with how Prime Minister Trudeau labeled people who were unvaccinated or didn't want vaccine mandates. Of course, that was a main theme in this trucker convoy. So what do you make of Prime Minister Trudeau now saying he would have rephrased things differently on the one time he said it, basically?
Well, I didn't actually see his comments, Andrea, so I'll have to go off what you just told me. But, you know, let's give him credit for that. That's what he should have done in the first place, right? Because a lot of the remarks that Trudeau had made, that Prime Minister Trudeau had made, really alienated people and led to this protest in the first place. And if he's going to reform his behavior to some extent, that might be one of the positive things that comes out of this.
Like when they say, "Oh, I will have rephrased myself in another way about the French minority who held unacceptable views." For me, anyway, you should not have said that as a prime minister. But it was like I was seeing in his face the uncomfortable side of it, that he knew he did something wrong when he said that sentence, because afterwards everybody used that in all media. Everywhere.
Yeah. He's been faced with that question before as well. And this is the first time I've seen him actually handle it that way. I said this to Sheila. I feel like he campaigned on the division. He campaigned on dividing people and saying, vote for me because we are the only option to keep you safe. And this is how we're going to do it. And so now to see him backpedal of this, I almost see it as sort of a new campaign strategy. Maybe his own MPs are displeased with the approach he took. We know a couple of them spoke out about that. And maybe he's finally seeing the tide is shifting. But he said in particular, he shouldn't have called them a small fringe minority. Right. So very interesting. And Alexa, I want to ask you about Krista Freeland saying that the reason they used the Emergency Act was to ensure that nobody got hurt, which is not the case for you.
No, and it's also written in the report that nobody got injured seriously, or nobody get really injured in a way. So I was like, seriously? When I know that I interviewed that woman that got trampled by the horse, I saw she was suffering. And I saw my colleague Guillaume Roy being pepper spray, and it was hurting too. I saw some people being beat up by the police, and they were injured. And I got shocked too. But it's the fact that this is not true. A lot of people get injured, and I saw a lot of people with bruises and cut in the face, blooding. And I'm sorry, this is not the same definition of what is injuries.
Now you see these, or we heard these sort of pseudo-democratic phrases coming out of Trudeau. I say that because he's saying we will always stand for the right to protest. We will always stand for, diversity of thought and things like that. But then we see what happened with the Emergency Act being invoked. And so my question is, if this is justified in this situation, and we know that it was a peaceful protest, even Trudeau, he said, there were people with extreme ideologies that may have acted, not that they did act, that they may have acted. So my question is, what could have been done differently? If this many people, and Alan, I'm directing this question to you, maybe you can answer from a legal perspective, but if this many people come together after months and months of not being happy with mandates from the government, and they come and they go to Parliament and they get there and their intention is to protest until they're heard or until the mandates drop, what exactly could they have done differently? Or anybody gone in the future, what could people do differently so that this Emergency Act isn't enacted?
Well, that's a really good question, Drea. And what can people do differently in a protest of that size?
Yeah.
Almost impossible for anyone to really control something like that, right? Because, and let's just be honest about this protest. It was unprecedented, right? And it was unprecedented because there was so much dissatisfaction out there about what the federal government was doing and what provincial and municipal governments were doing, right? But I don't think anybody will be able to control a group that's that big and that diverse and even that diffuse, right? Because it's all over the country. Now, as for not doing something to prevent the invocation of the Emergencies Act, that's somewhat out of our hands, isn't it?
Right.
Because those decisions are made behind closed doors by the government and their advisors in cabinet meetings, in these IRG meetings. So I don't think we can do anything about that except vote for better politicians who won't invoke these acts which are potentially abusive.
Alexa, were you at all surprised? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, if I can add something, it's just during the whole process of the public order emergency commission, we receive the evidence and the documents sometime the same day, and it was always throwing some information, so people had some difficulty to keep up and to be sure that all the information get out of this whole commission. But today was about the same. We received, first of all, in 2 hours lockup in a room with a document about 2,000 pages in 2 hours to review and to get the information out. I have again the impression that they don't want that we get the bottom out of all the information that's been said in that report, because in a month from now, when we will probably pass through and digest this whole document, people will have passed to something else and just forget about this commission since they have the verdict. So again, I just have the impression that this commission is just in fact something to justify his act, but not really being there for giving the full information clear to the public.
Right. Yeah, it's impossible for you to go through 2,000 pages and then be able to convey the meat and potatoes of what was written in the ruling. Can you tell us something you did come across in the time that you've been able to look at the documents that people should know about?
But first of all, they were talking about disinformation and misinformation. They actually say that the news media have contributed to it, and they give the example of the arson. The fire that they were supposed to be related to protester of the convoy, but that finally the police came out and saying that they have no link with the protester. So that was one of the false information that was spread in media. Also, they were talking about they talk a lot about the disinformation and misinformation about COVID-19. They did talk a lot and repeatedly, like say it about, and that probably did create more pressure and more people involved in this movement. I was like, okay, it depends on what you're talking about, disinformation and misinformation. We can be more clear at this level. Who is spreading the misinformation in that level?
According to whom?
They exactly. And they also talk a lot about the miscommunication between all the law enforcement, the government and institution too. We know that they had a lack of communication. It's why most of their recommendation is giving to improve that communication between the different like institution and police. They also talk about some of the member from group that joined the movement that was not really related to it, but they joined it as the Farfada from Quebec, and also Pat King and Romana, that actually unfortunately painted badly the whole movement. Same if they are not with all, like they don't represent all the protesters. So some part I'm actually totally disagree, as he say that he doesn't believe at all the Hendon report on what they say about the violence that was present. The Hendon report say that there were not no violence and no nothing to report on illegal action. And he say, I disagree with the violence because he heard some testimony about having violence in the convoy. So it's his own interpretation, we will say, and I have the impression that he's taking really aside on when we really look at all the recommendation in his opinion on the whole report.
Now, Alan, did you get a chance to look at the recommendations that were made for the next time or even possible revisions to the Act? And what did you think of them?
Thanks for asking. I haven't had a lot of time to read over the Act, but I did go through the recommendations briefly, and the one recommendation that really stuck out for me was that the Commissioner suggested that the reference to threats to the security of Canada should be removed from the definition of a public order emergency. And I think the effect of that is that it makes a public order emergency a little bit easier to invoke. Right? Yeah. And so that's something that I would actually respectfully disagree with the Commissioner about. I think that's an important part of the Emergencies Act. It's an important part of the definition of a public order emergency, and maybe we can beef it up a little bit, maybe we can clarify it a little bit, but I don't think we should get rid of it entirely, because that's really what was most contentious at the public order emergency inquiry, right? It was this debate over whether or not there were threats to the security of Canada, specifically in terms of threats of violence or serious violence to persons or property.
You know, you're right, and it would make it way more easier. I mean, the bar would be quite low after that. Alexa, did you want to comment on that?
Yes, because I read all the recommendation myself, and as I say, yes, this is true. They try to make the Emergencies Act more available, more easy to use. But also, I didn't really like the recommendation 53 that actually talk about the government to fight against disinformation and misinformation on social media, and to try to stop all this like in propaganda online. So that just give me more power to the government to put more law in place to control all what we saw online.
And to circle back with Prime Minister, and I know you guys might not have seen this yet, but he says that he would have rephrased the small fringe minority, and that really that language was sort of meant to just a small amount of people within the group who had been spreading misinformation and disinformation. And he even said are linked to more deaths. So he's accusing this sort of cabal of the trucker movement as killing people. And on the flip side of that, he's saying that all these people that came together are just dumb idiots that followed those people's misinformation. What do you make of that? Go, Alexa. I know you're burning to answer it.
yeah, because I saw that also in the report, and what they say in the report, they say, and that is Rouleau saying that, they say, I expect that the Prime Minister was intending to refer to a small number of people who were expressing racist, extremist, or otherwise reprehensible views, rather than to all Freedom Convoy participants. I'm sorry, but I always say it. It was like the small fringe minority who are on their way to Ottawa, who are holding unacceptable views. It was not about racist or stuff like that. It was about the fact that people were at like another line of thinking about the decision making by the government from the last 2 years.
Yeah. Alan, I'm going to ask you a question. Sheila asked me, she basically, neither of us were surprised about the findings. So my first question is, were you surprised? But is there a time during the whole commission where you thought this is the result we were going to end up with? Is there anything that made you think that way?
Well, no, I'm not surprised by the findings, right? And I don't think there was any point in time when I thought, oh, that's it. The commissioner is going to rule in this way. I always sort of suspected that this would be the case. And part of the reason for this, Drea, is because the terms are not very precise, right? And this actually comes out in the report a bit. When you look at the words, threat and violence and serious, they're somewhat open-ended. They're not really exactly defined, right? And some people, have even gone so far as to say that these are definitions which are capable of extension, right? So to me, I have a pretty I have a sort of an idea in my head what a threat of serious violence is, and I don't think we heard any evidence of anything like that in the 6 weeks of public hearings. But there are a whole lot of little things that we heard about, and it's no surprise to me that all those little things have sort of cumulatively added up to what was really, I think, essentially missing from the evidence.
That's what we saw today. Now, Alexa, how about yourself? Were you surprised at any point in time with what happened?
I was actually panicking with the 2,000 page. I was like, I just want to know, if it was justified or not, where he's writing on it. And I was just passing the page and just looking for it. And when I saw it, I was not really surprised. It's really what I was expecting from. But now my question remains. We know that some MP went out to talk about the verdict, and as the NDP, who actually say that is a failure of the multiple level of policing. So they will ask for an election since the NDP will do a lot of different in the balance. So this is what I need to see. Do we will have an election or not?
Right. Yeah, there was the statement that it was a failure of federalism. And yeah, so what do you make of that statement, Alan?
This statement that
It was one of the
finding
concerns.
in the Public Order Emergency Act was a failure of federalism? Is
Well,
that what it is?
the finding was that it was justified, but he said that there were concerns that there was a failure of federalism within that.
Well, I haven't arrived at that part of the report. If it's in the report,
This is all right off the cuff. But do you believe there was a failure of federalism? Working with the other provinces that were involved in this.
Well, there's there's a duty to consult with the other provinces, and I haven't read what the commissioner said about that yet. But it seems to me that whatever happened there, if what happened counts as consultation, it wasn't really meaningful consultation, right? These provincial ministers were gathered on the morning of the day when Justin Trudeau decided to invoke the Emergencies Act. Some of them expressed concerns. They had no warning, really.
Right.
No formal warning, at least. And is that a breakdown in federalism? I wouldn't go so far to say that. I'd say that it's just an example of the act not working out like it was supposed to work out. But I think, generally federalism is a good thing for people who don't like who don't like tyranny, right? Because it divides powers between different governments, right? So one person or one government is not in charge of everything. And that's one of the traditional justifications for federalism. I think that's still in place. It's not a federalism problem. It's a problem with politicians.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that were asked in the question and answer period time was whether or not Prime Minister Trudeau believed he owed an apology to some of the people that got caught up in the bank seizures. So not necessarily for everyone who had their bank account seized, but some, maybe it was a joint account with a spouse or something like that. He made no apology, kind of danced around it and said, we might learn things in the future. But what is your opinions on no apology to basically the people who couldn't even pay their bills, some of them?
Yeah, well, I think, number one, he should apologize to people who had their accounts frozen. Even if he was justified in doing that, there should have been some way for these people to get their accounts unfrozen.
Right.
Right. It should have been. Yeah. And for people who were completely innocent, and I think you're referring to those people when you say people who held joint bank accounts with somebody who might have been at the protest area. There should have been some recourse for them, right?
Yeah.
I think, going back to a question that you asked earlier, though, about the fringe minority, if Trudeau is saying now that he should have said that differently, maybe he owes an apology to a lot of people that he's alienated with that remark and with other remarks that he's made throughout the past several months.
Right. And he said, I wish I would have worded it differently, but still no apology. So, yeah.
But
well, is there
at the
any
same time, I was just going to say in the same time, the conclusion of the Rouleau report actually say that he didn't have his conclusion. He have no existence of fault, and that was his conclusion for the financial and for institution, because he said that first of all, his mandate was not necessary for his mandate to find the fault, first of all. And the second, that is because the institution or the representation of the institution have been either misleading or deficient, but they didn't reach the point to cause a default. So it's why.
All right, so I think we're going to throw to an ad, and then we have lawyer of Tamara Leach coming on, Keith Wilson. Thank you, guys.
I am speaking to you at a moment of grave crisis. when violent and fanatical men are attempting to destroy the unity and the freedom of Canada.
But after weeks of dangerous and unlawful activities, after weeks of people being harassed in their neighborhoods and small businesses forced to close,
As democracy flourishes in Canada,
we don't always agree, and that's okay.
because individual liberty is cherished in Canada.
Our government will always defend freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly.
It has now been demonstrated to us by a few misguided persons
After evidence of increased ideologically motivated violent extremism activity across the country,
just how fragile a democratic society can be.
it became clear that local and provincial authorities needed more tools to restore order and keep people safe.
These are matters of the utmost gravity, and I want to tell you what the government is doing to deal with them.
The federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act.
The public's legitimate right to know why the government proclaimed an emergency and whether the actions it took were appropriate.
It is our view that there was no justification whatsoever to invoke the Emergencies Act.
It's so tough to watch. There's no reason for that. They were literally running the horses through the crowd.
The police came straight to me and he targeted me and he took his gun of tear gas and he actually shot me directly in my legs.
Was it worth invoking the Emergencies Act, ma'am, to trample on the rights and freedoms of Canadians?
Why do you think excessive honking means that the government should strip citizens away from their rights?
Our next and final witness is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Order à l'ordre.
Have you checked out the fresh new swag we have at rebelnewsstore.com? Like this nifty resistance trucker sweater. We have warm, cozy sweaters, t-shirts, mugs, hats, phone cases, you name it. Everything to fit your freedom-loving needs or maybe even trigger a liberal family member or friend. And for a limited time, you can use code TAMARA10 at checkout to save 10% off of your total order. So head on over to rebelnewsstore.com, check out all of our new designs, make some purchases, and use code TAMARA, that's TAMARA 10 at checkout for 10% off your order. Head on over, check it out.
Well, hello, Keith Wilson. Thanks for joining us. You represented some of the convoy organizers, most notably Tamara Leach. What do you make of the findings?
Well, I'm in Calgary right now, and the hotel that we're at for an event here, I'm with Tamara and a number of the other road captains and Freedom Convoy leaders. And when we reviewed the findings, I had come out of another room and came into the room where Tamara and others were. And it was like coming into a room when you learned a family member had died. A lot of sadness.
Yeah, it's a sad day for Canada, really, much like when the Emergencies Act was invoked. It's almost reliving that again and experiencing it. So I definitely feel for that room, but I feel for it myself here as a Canadian. Did you get a chance to hear some of the comments that Prime Minister Trudeau said? And if so, what stuck out to you the most?
Well, I did, but I'd like to first share with you what Tamara and others
please do.
Want to know. And that is, this is a dark day for Canada. And the reason it's a dark day for Canada is anybody who was observing the events in Ottawa during the protests know that there is no way any thinking person can say that they came to the same scale of national emergency that World War I, World War II, and the FLQ crisis from the 1970s did, where there was bombings, kidnapping of diplomats, and murders. So what's happened here is Justice Rouleau has affirmed and blessed and given the green light to future governments to use this unrestrained power to override Canadians' rights and freedoms, to seize their property without warrant or process, to freeze their business bank accounts, to freeze their personal bank accounts. So this decision has huge implications because it says that if this government or a future government does not like some Canadians' views, does not like what some Canadians are saying bad about the government, that it's okay. You can just go ahead and use the Emergencies Act. So I think this is going to have really, like, if we just stop and think about this and not worry too much about the minutia of, page 179 versus page 1043, what does this mean? One of the things that came out during the inquiry and leading up to it was that investors around the world were looking, going, what happened to Canada? Wait a minute, I can go up there and if my company is somehow implicated with something the government doesn't like, they can seize my property and freeze my bank account personally and corporately. Well, we know they do that in Venezuela. We know they did that in Cuba. So I really think the reputation of Canada has been damaged by this. I think our country is different today than it was yesterday because there was some faint hope. A number of the guests you've had on, Alan Honor and others, have said they weren't surprised. Well, because they didn't have a high degree of confidence that the commissioner was going to come out against the government. That's why they weren't surprised. Not that because they thought the threshold was met. So it's a dark day for the country. The rights and freedoms that my kids had growing up, or till a few years ago, and that I certainly had growing up, are no longer. We're no longer the Canada true north and free. We're no longer this model of fresh air and freedom. It's really a seriously dark day, and I'm conveying to you what Tamara and the other Freedom Convoy truckers who were on the ground and led the convoy across the country and endured Ottawa have communicated to me.
Wow. And you're right. So many people, like internationally, were looking at Canada while this was all happening. I'm sure they're going to be looking at this finding in just awe. And it's almost like we're becoming a standard of, hey, let's not become like Canada. What about some of the recommendations that were given? Are you at all concerned about any of those?
Well, I think it's distraction, frankly, because the core problem remains that there is not a world war. There is not a war that we're involved in on our borders. There was never anything like the FLQ, and the government got to use tools they've never used before. How many times do you carry cash with you, right? Everybody's digital. And I still remember one of my clients, Freedom Convoy leader, getting the phone call from his wife who was in the checkout at the grocery store. And the groceries had been packaged and were put in the bags and in the cart. And there's a lineup and she goes to use the first credit card and it doesn't work. And, people are getting impatient. Oh, what's wrong with this person? And then she uses the next one and it doesn't work. And then she uses the debit card and it doesn't work. And then she has to leave in embarrassment without the groceries with her kids. That's the power here, guys. And not companies that couldn't make payroll because their business accounts were closed. So there was comments again about Canada becoming a banana republic, appeared in some of the notes from one of the cabinet ministers, that where a foreign official or an investment leader was critical of the government's rash actions of freezing bank accounts. And this decision today, greenlighting the government to use these powers whenever it doesn't like what Canadians are saying about it, I think really does move us into that banana republic category. But I do have some thoughts on, I think, what we can do going forward that I'd like to share if you're interested.
Yes, please do.
So, I think one of the things we found when I was on the ground representing the truckers in Ottawa during the protests, representing them throughout the summer, and then preparing for the inquiry, is at every turn it seemed that the government would overplay its hand. And I think the government just overplayed its hand. And what do I mean by that? I think a great number of Canadians are going to be deeply disturbed when they reflect on this decision today, and Justice Rouleau green lighting the broad use of this power in the future. And I think Canadians are going to say, wait a minute, no. I ain't giving up this easy. I know Tamara's not. She's full of feist today, I can tell you that. She had tears this morning, but boy, she's got fire in her eyes right now. We can signal to our political leaders in our various political parties, you better take a position on this. Because if you take a position that this was too far, that this was not acceptable, that this is not reflective of Canadian values of freedom and respect for human rights and freedoms of Canadians and the ability for Canadians to protest and have civil dissent, then they can elect a party that reflects that. And that party can change the Emergencies Act. The Parliament, we're not stuck with this thing. We can make the threshold so high that these types of abuses that Alexa and others physically encountered in its most kinetic form, and the other less subtle but more insidious abuses of freezing bank accounts doesn't happen again. So I'm optimistic that Canadians will reflect and they'll say, no, we're not going to accept this. This is completely wrong. This law needs to change. Rouleau did a great job of trying to build some cover for his Liberal friends and make them feel better and maybe give them a chance of political survival. But Canadians know the truth. This was an abuse of power by a petulant prime minister who couldn't stand that many Canadians challenging his government's authoritarian overreach, in my view.
Well, thank you so much for those words. And on behalf of Tamara and the rest of who's in the room with you, our hearts go out to you and to the nation, really. But we'll keep following. And I hope you're right. I hope we see that the changes that they go ahead with are for the better in this situation. Thanks for being on Rebel News.
Thank you. And the work of Rebel News is now even more important because we know the legacy media is not going to say these things. So congratulations to you, and please do the heavy lifting that needs to be done. And thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Keith. And now I think we're going to jump to some chat. Some of you have been patiently waiting to get your words in here, starting with Billy Howard, donates $5. Thank you so much for helping keep the lights on. You say, this cannot be repeated enough. Rouleau absolved his brother's nephew, Justin Trudeau, of any wrongdoing. Justin Trudeau appointed his uncle's brother, Rouleau, to judge his EA declaration. So we did look into that. As far as I know, it's not the same person that people think they are, that's happening, but I'll have another look into it. But I have seen people think that. Mamanka donates $10. Thank you very much. Says, having to watch this is really a laugh or cry matter. You're right. It's like you're either going to go mad and cry or you got to laugh at it, because what else can you do? But as we just heard from Keith Wilson, maybe there is a silver lining here. Maybe the act will be changed for the better. Tan Tak donates $5. Thank you very much. Says, note, take heart. Rouleau says reasonable and informed people could reach a different conclusion than him. He states that his conclusion was difficult. The factual bases are not overwhelming. Very good point. Yeah, he doesn't say small fringe minority of racist, misogynistic extremists could come to a different opinion. He says reasonable and informed. Sunshine 2207 donates $10. Thank you again. Says, do you think that since the commission found the invocation was justified, there will now be criminal charges against some members of the convoy? Well, we've already seen that a little bit, but I hope not. The public inquiries are supposed to be about coming up with A, did the government act in a way that they should have? B, what changes should be made? It's not supposed to be sort of a trial, or else people won't just testify. So, but stranger things are starting to happen in Canada, but I hope that's not the case. Medi Sibdeb, I'm not sure how to say that, donates $5. Thank you very much. Says, my heart is broken over this. Absolutely. Such a sad day for Canada, but Canadians are strong. We will overcome this corruption. And I think that that is so in line with what the trucker convoy taught us in the start. That whole movement, the fact that it was peaceful, the fact that even though the commission is saying it's justified, Prime Minister Trudeau still had to use words like, this may have happened instead of this did happen. So yes, we are strong. We will get through this. Sunshine 2207 donates another $10. Thank you. And says, do you think that since the commission found the invocation was justified? Oh, I'm reading the same thing twice. So we're done. We're done the list. But yeah, let us know in the comments so other people can see there. Thank you for joining in on this live. It is a sad day for Canada, but we must continue to stand for rights and freedom and continue to do so peacefully so that the vast majority of Canadians look at the situation and go, something is wrong here. And at least that, at the very least, will wake up more eyes. And make sure to head to our website with the documentary. If you didn't catch much of the proceedings, you can go to that documentary, TrudeauOnTrial.com, and get the snippets from Kian Simone. And there you can even sign up to go in person to watch that with others and just vent about this whole thing. So thank you. Drea Humphrey for Rebel News.
After careful reflection, I have concluded that the very high threshold required for the invocation of the Act was met. In particular, for reasons that I discuss in detail in the report, I've concluded that when the decision was made to invoke the Act on February 14th, 2022, Cabinet had reasonable grounds to believe that there existed a national emergency arising from threats to the security of Canada that necessitated the taking of special temporary measures. I do not come to this conclusion easily, as I do not consider the factual basis for it to be overwhelming. Reasonable and informed people could reach a different conclusion than the one I've arrived at. After careful reflection, I have